Number 1. The Garamantes. Picture a man far below the Sahara, on his knees in a tunnel barely wider than his shoulders, chipping at rock in the dark while a single oil lamp gutters at his side. He is listening for the sound of water. Above him, sand stretches to the horizon, and yet somewhere ahead in the blackness a thin seam of moisture is waiting. That tunnel was called a fogara, and it was one link in a network that ran for roughly 750 kilometers beneath the desert of southwest Libya. The people who dug it were the Garamantes, and they were no scattering of desert nomads. They built a genuine civilization in the Fezzan region, with a capital called Garamant that lies beneath the modern village of Jarma. They flourished between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE, and at their height, they were the dominant power of the Central Sahara. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, called them a great nation and described them hunting across the sands from 4 horse chariots. Their secret was water that should not have been there. Deep beneath the Fezzan sat an aquifer of fossil water, rain that had soaked into Nubian sandstone during a wetter age thousands of years earlier and had never been replenished. The Garamantes reached it with the Fogaras, a gently sloping tunnel that tapped the buried water table and let gravity carry the flow downhill to their fields, marked at the surface only by long lines of vertical access shafts. David Mattingly of the University of Leicester led the survey that mapped this hidden plumbing, and the scale of it is staggering for a desert people. But the system carried a flaw inside its own design. A fogari does not borrow water, it mines it. Every tunnel drew down a finite reserve that the desert could never refill, which means the countdown began with the very first shaft. As long as the water table stayed high, the Garamantes thrived, built mud brick towns, and raised thousands of pyramid-shaped tombs. The labor was brutal, and much of the digging was likely done by captives taken in Saharan raids. And then the water started to fall. As the table dropped, tunnel after tunnel ran dry, and reaching what remained meant digging deeper and longer for less and less return. Somewhere across the 4th to 7th centuries CE, the arithmetic turned against them. When their trade and raiding networks frayed and the labor to maintain the tunnels disappeared, the whole system failed. Historians still debate the weighting. The mainstream view holds that aquifer depletion and a drying climate were the killers. Others argue that political fragmentation stopped the maintenance first. An older, romantic notion of a lost desert race has been discarded entirely. Here's why it should unsettle you. The Garamantes are one of the few civilizations in history to have engineered their own extinction, outdigging their water until there was none. And today, Libya's great man-made river pumps that exact same fossil aquifer to supply modern cities today. Number 2. Helike. On a winter night in 373 BCE, the ground beneath the Greek city began to convulse, and within hours the entire city had slid beneath black water and vanished. Its name was Helike, and before that night it had been one of the proudest cities of the Peloponnese. The ancient writer Aelian recorded something strange in the days before the disaster. The animals fled. Rats, snakes, weasels, and centipedes were seen streaming out of the city toward higher ground, as if they knew what the people did not. Helike sat in Achaia, on the Gulf of Corinth, and it led the first Achaean League of 12 cities. It was also a sacred place, the center of the cult of Helicanarian Poseidon, god of both the sea and the earthquake. A powerful quake dropped the coastal city downward, the waterlogged ground liquefied, and a tsunami surged in over the ruins. Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Pausanias all wrote about it, and travelers crossing the water reported seeing the drowned ruins below the surface, including a bronze statue of Poseidon standing on the seabed. The event was so vivid that it may have shaped the most famous story of a lost civilization ever told. Plato wrote his account of Atlantis, a great city swallowed by the sea, around 360 BCE, barely a decade after Helike sank. Now here's where the search went wrong for 2,000 years. Everyone assumed Helike had sunk into the open sea, so that is where they looked and they found nothing. The truth was stranger. When Dora Katsonopoulou and Stephen Soter began the Helike project in 1988, they realized the city had dropped not into the Mediterranean, but into an inland lagoon, which had later filled with river silt and turned back into dry coastal plain. Helike was not out at sea. It was buried under a field. In 2001, the team found the classical destruction layer inland with buildings and clear evidence of the drowning. Beneath it lay something even older, an early Bronze Age town that had also been catastrophically abandoned long before. The rivers Selinus and Caronites had buried everything under centuries of mud, which is exactly why the sea searches had failed. The date, though, is fixed with rare precision by ancient testimony, the winter of 373 BCE. Scholars agree on the essentials. A large earthquake on the actively spreading Gulf of Corinth rift caused the subsidence and the wave. The more speculative and haunting possibility is that a real catastrophe, remembered across a single generation, seeded the myth of Atlantis itself. And the reason this still matters is simple. The Gulf of Corinth remains one of the fastest opening rifts on Earth, which means the same combination that erased Helike in a night still threatens the towns that stand on that coast today. Number 3. The Hohokam. Rise above the Arizona desert and look down, and you would once have seen something that does not belong in a desert at all. A vast web of canals, hundreds of miles of them, cut by hand through the sand and feeding green fields of maize and cotton where there should have been nothing but stone and heat. This was the work of the Hohokam, and it was the largest irrigation network anywhere in ancient North America. The Hohokam lived in the Sonoran Desert along the Salt and Gila rivers from roughly 450 to 1450 CE. Their canals ran for tens of kilometers, carefully graded, so that river water would flow across the flat desert entirely by gravity without a single pump. To build that, and to keep it working for 1,000 years, took an engineering culture of real sophistication. At the village of Snaketown, excavated by Emil Horry of the University of Arizona, archaeologists found red on buff pottery, shell jewelry etched with acid, and ball courts that echo the great cultures of Mexico far to the south. At their peak, tens of thousands of people lived in this desert entirely on the strength of irrigation. In the later Classic period, they raised structures like Casa Grande, a 4-story building of hard-packed caliche that still stands today. But the canals hid the same kind of trap that doomed the Garamantes. Everything depended on the river channel staying at exactly the right level so that water would run into the mouths of the canals. In the 14th century, that balance broke. A series of catastrophic floods tore through the valleys and cut the river channels deeper, entrenching them so that the water now ran below the level of the canal intakes. The field simply could not be reached. Then, as if to finish the job, drought reduced the rivers so that even the surviving canals ran dry. Across the 1300s and 1400s, flood and drought traded blows, and each cycle made the network harder to repair. On top of that, 1,000 years of irrigation had likely salted and waterlogged the soils, poisoning the very ground that fed them. By around 1450, the great villages emptied and the people scattered into smaller groups. Their descendants are the Hohokam peoples, and the word Hohokam, from which Hohokam comes, means roughly those who are gone or those who are used up. The mainstream reading is a compound environmental failure, floods entrenching the channels and drought starving them. Others emphasize an internal collapse, the breakdown of the cooperative labor needed to keep the canals alive. And the reason this one lands so hard is what came next. When settlers founded a city here in the 1800s, they dug their own canals along the exact lines the Hohokam had left, and they named the place Phoenix, after the bird that rises from the ashes of the dead. That modern city now depends on the same rivers and faces the same desert arithmetic that erased the people who came first. Number 4. The Moche. At the foot of a huge mud brick pyramid on the coast of Peru, archaeologists uncovered a plaza floor layered with the bones of sacrificed men, and pressed between those layers was something telling: the dried mud of catastrophic rain. The man who excavated it, Steve Bourget, realized that the killings and the flooding belonged together. This was the world of the Moche. The Moche flourished on the arid north coast of Peru from about 100 to 800 CE. They were not a single empire, but a set of regional powers sharing one art style and one religion. They were master metalworkers, casting gold and silver and copper with gilding and lost wax techniques that rival any in the ancient Americas. Their potters made portrait vessels so lifelike you can read individual faces across 15 centuries. Near modern Trujillo, they raised the Huaca del Sol, a pyramid built from more than 130 million mud bricks. In 1987, Walter Alva excavated the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, an intact royal burial packed with gold, one of the richest ever found in the New World. This was a civilization at the height of its powers. And like so many on this list, it lived and died by water, drawing river flow from the Andes through canals into the coastal desert. Then, the sky turned against the coast in two directions at once. The Cahokia ice cap, studied by Lonnie Thompson, records a severe drought that gripped the region in the late 6th century, roughly the years 563 to 594. But the same era also brought monstrous El Nino floods, torrential rains that ripped the irrigation canals apart. The coast was whipsawed, drowned one year and starved the next, while wind-driven dunes buried fields and buildings during the dry spells. Here is the detail that changes how you read those sacrifices. As the disasters mounted, the killing at the pyramids intensified, and the bodies lie interleaved with the flood mud itself. It may be that this was not simple cruelty, but desperation, a society trying to bargain with a sky that would not relent. The mainstream view, argued by Michael Mosley and Izumi Shimada, is that the mega El Nino and the drought together broke the irrigation economy. Others stress internal warfare and elite rivalry that the climate shock merely accelerated. The more speculative reading ties the escalating sacrifice directly to the flood's ritual attempts to end the rains. Whatever the balance, the Moche order dissolved across the 7th and 8th centuries. In later cultures, the Sikan and then the Chimu rose on the same ground, and the stakes could not be more current. Those exact valleys still drown in El Nino years, as they did in 1998 and again in 2017, flooding modern cities built on the very floodplains the Moche could not tame. Number 5. The Khmer Empire. Stand at dawn before the towers of Angkor Wat and look at their reflection in the great reservoir before them, and imagine that reservoir half-cracked mud and half-overflowing flood at the same time. That contradiction is, in a sense, what killed the Khmer Empire. Because Angkor was not just a temple, it was the beating heart of the largest city the pre-industrial world ever built. Greater Angkor sprawled across roughly 1,000 square kilometers, a low-density metropolis of temples, houses, fields, and canals, home to somewhere between 700,000 and nearly 1 million people. The empire began in 802 CE when Jayavarman II declared independence, and it endured for 6 centuries. Its foundation was water. The Khmer engineered an enormous system of reservoirs called barays, along with moats and canals, to capture the monsoon rains and release them across the dry season for rice. The West Baray alone measured about 7.8 kilometers by 2.1, holding millions of cubic meters of water. Suryavarman II raised Angkor Wat around the 1100s, the largest religious monument on earth. Jayavarman VII added the walled city of Angkor Thom and the strange-faced towers of the Bayon. Then the climate that filled the reservoirs turned unstable. Brendan Buckley and his colleagues reconstructed the region's rainfall by reading the growth rings of ancient cypress trees on a Vietnamese mountain, and the record they published in 2010 was alarming. It revealed 2 severe droughts, one in the 1340s to 1360s and another in the early 1400s, and between them, years of unusually violent monsoon. That whiplash was the true weapon. The floods scoured and choked the canals with sediment, while the droughts left the reservoirs empty, and the Greater Angkor project, led by Roland Fletcher and Christophe Potier, found the physical scars, breached embankments, and desperate makeshift repairs. The system's very size became its weakness. It was so vast and so interconnected that a failure in one place could starve or flood entire districts downstream. Dan Penny's careening of the sediment showed the network decaying and falling out of use in the empire's final phase. In 1431, the rival kingdom of Ayutthaya sacked Angkor, and the Khmer court moved south toward Phnom Penh, pivoting from an economy of temples and rice toward maritime trade. Historians divide the blame. The mainstream case from Buckley, Fletcher, and Penny is climate-driven hydraulic failure, a city wholly dependent on managed water that could not survive the monsoon turning erratic. Others weight the sack by Ayutthaya, the spread of a new religion, and the lure of sea trade. A more provocative thought asks whether the elite poured too much into building temples, while the water system that actually kept people alive was left to rot. Either way, modern monsoon Asia, with its own dam-dependent megacities, faces the same whiplash that Angkor could not absorb. Number 6. Teotihuacan. Along a great stone avenue in the Valley of Mexico, the temples are burning. Flames climb the pyramids and dark smoke rolls across the sky, and yet the ordinary houses that fill the rest of the city stand untouched. That single detail, fire aimed only at the seats of power, is the clue to one of the greatest collapses in the ancient Americas. This was Teotihuacan, and at its height it was one of the largest cities on the entire planet. Teotihuacan rose in the basin of Mexico around 100 BCE and peaked between roughly 100 and 550 CE, holding well over 100,000 people. The Pyramid of the Sun stands about 65 meters tall, and with the Pyramid of the Moon, it anchors the great processional road we call the Avenue of the Dead. The whole city was laid out on a deliberate grid, tilted about 15.5 degrees east of north, a feat of urban planning almost unheard of for its age. Beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, Saburo Sugiyama and Ruben Cabrera found more than 200 sacrificed people, many of them bound warriors. Its citizens lived in walled apartment compounds, some of them home to distinct ethnic groups, a neighborhood of Oaxacans, a Maya presence, a district of merchants. And yet, strangely, we cannot name a single one of its kings. There are no royal portraits, no dynastic monuments, which has led scholars to wonder whether it was ruled by some kind of council rather than a lone god king. Around 550 CE, that unknown order came to a violent end. The city's civic and ceremonial core was deliberately burned, and here is the crucial pattern. The destruction concentrated on the temples and elite structures, not on the homes of the common people. This was not a foreign army sacking a city at random. It looks like an uprising from within, a turning of the people against their own rulers. Behind it lay years of pressure, drought, and resource strain around a swollen population, and possibly a distant blow. The eruption of the Ilopango volcano in Central America, which may have disrupted the trade the city relied on. George Cowgill and Linda Manzanilla have argued that the heart of it was internal, elite mismanagement during hard times boiling over into revolt. The mainstream view blends that with environmental stress. A more speculative reading calls it one of the earliest class revolutions we can actually see in the archaeological record. After the fire, the population collapsed and the city emptied over the following century, and then comes the eerie coda. Centuries later, the Aztecs stumbled on the ruins and were so awed that they named the place Teotihuacan, meaning the place where the gods were created, and made it a site of pilgrimage. They assumed a race of vanished giants had built it. The people who actually raised that city had been forgotten so completely that their own successors could not imagine they had been human. Number 7. The Kingdom of Aksum. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia lies a broken giant, a single carved shaft of granite 33 meters long, cracked into pieces where it fell in the tall grass. It was the largest standing stone the ancient world ever tried to raise, and it marks the grave of an empire that most people today have never heard of. This was Aksum, and in its day, it stood among the great powers of the earth. The Persian writer Mani, in the 3rd century, listed the 4 greatest kingdoms of the world as Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. From its base in the Ethiopian highlands and its Red Sea port of Adulis, Aksum controlled the trade between the Roman Mediterranean and India, moving ivory, gold, and incense. It was one of the very few states in all of ancient Africa to mint its own coinage, in gold, silver, and bronze, and those coins have been found as far away as India, proof of how far its commerce reached. Around 340 CE, King Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the earliest Christian states anywhere, and his coins recorded the change, swapping their old pagan symbols for the cross. The kingdom raised its towering stelae over royal tombs, and one of them, a shaft 24 meters tall, weighing around 160 tons, was looted by Mussolini's forces in 1937, and stood in Rome until it was finally returned to Ethiopia in the 2000s. Then the world shifted beneath Aksum's feet. From the 7th and 8th centuries, the rise of Islam and the new naval power of Arab and Persian fleets redirected the Red Sea trade away from Adulis. The routes that had made Aksum rich now flowed elsewhere, and without that trade, the coinage economy withered. At the same time, the land itself was failing. Generations of intensive highland farming had exhausted the soil and stripped the hillsides, and a drying climate deepened the strain. The plague of Justinian, which spread along these very trade routes from 541 CE, may have struck the crowded ports as well. Slowly, the center of gravity retreated inland, monumental buildings stopped, and the great capital faded. Scholars like Stuart Monroe Hay and David Phillipson have pieced the story together from coins and ruins. The mainstream view is that the loss of Red Sea trade, compounded by environmental degradation, drained the empire's lifeblood. Others put the ecological collapse first, the over-farmed highlands giving out. A further thread adds the plague as the demographic shock that tipped an already staggering state. But Aksum did not vanish without a legacy. Its Christianity survived the fall of its kings and flowed directly into the later Ethiopian kingdom and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church that endures to this day. Its lesson is a sharp one. A civilization that lives on trade can be hollowed out in a generation, not by an enemy at its gates, but by the quiet redrawing of the roots that feed it. Number 8. Petra and the Nabataeans. In the year 363 CE, the ground beneath the desert city heaved and dust shook loose from the most famous carved facade in the ancient world, the rose-red front of Petra's treasury. That earthquake broke more than stone. It broke the hidden system that had allowed a city to live in a place where a city should have been impossible. The people who built it were the Nabataeans, and they were among the greatest water engineers the ancient world ever produced. The Nabataeans were an Arab people who raised a desert kingdom from around the 4th century BCE, with Petra as its jewel. They carved monuments straight into the sandstone cliffs, the treasury and the great monastery among them. And they grew wealthy by controlling the caravan trade in frankincense, myrrh, and spices flowing from Arabia to the Mediterranean. But their true genius was invisible. It was the plumbing. Petra sits in a desert that receives almost no rain, and yet it supported perhaps 20 to 30,000 people. The Nabataeans achieved that with an intricate network of dams, cisterns, and ceramic pipes that captured every drop of the rare rainfall and stored it. Through the Sik, the narrow canyon that guards the entrance to the city, they channeled and tamed the flash floods that would otherwise have killed anyone inside, turning a deadly torrent into a managed water supply. The engineer Charles Ortloff has shown just how advanced this was, with pressurized pipelines and basins to settle out the sediment. In 106 CE, the empire annexed the kingdom under Trajan, and Petra carried on as a Roman city. Slowly, though, the trade that fed it began to drift towards sea routes and rival hubs. And then came the earthquake of 363, which destroyed roughly half the city, and more importantly, damaged the water system that kept it alive. A second great quake struck the region in 551. With its plumbing crippled and its trade diverted, Petra could no longer sustain its people, and it declined into a shadow. The mainstream reading gives the earthquake the decisive role, wrecking the water system while trade drained away. Others argue the economy was already dying as caravans went to sea, with the quake merely finishing a slow decline. A more sobering view is that a desert city of that size was always just one broken aqueduct from the end. Byzantine Christians built churches in the ruins, and carbonized scrolls found in one of them, the Petra Papyri, record ordinary life continuing for a while before the silence. Eventually, Petra fell out of Western knowledge entirely until a Swiss traveler named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt talked his way into the canyon in disguise in 1812. And the lesson it leaves is stark. Even the most brilliant engineering, water coaxed out of solid rock, can be undone in a matter of minutes by a single shudder of the earth. Number 9. The Indus Valley. Walk the streets of Mohenjo-Daro today, and you find yourself in a city built on a grid, with straight brick roads, a great public bath sealed watertight, and a drainage system so advanced it would not be matched for thousands of years. Then look past the walls, and you see the thing that ended it, a dead river channel curving away into cracked and empty earth. This was the Indus Valley civilization, the largest of all the Bronze Age worlds, and it was erased not by an army, but by the sky forgetting to rain. In its mature phase from about 2600 to 1900 BCE, the Indus civilization spread across more than 1 million square kilometers of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, with over 1,000 settlements. Its great cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were marvels of order. They used standardized fired bricks, uniform weights and measures, and a script of more than 400 signs that no one has ever managed to read. Their sanitation was the finest in the ancient world, with private wells, bathing platforms, and covered drains running beneath the streets. Strangest of all, we find no clear sign of kings, no grand temples, no great armies. Power here seems to have been decentralized, perhaps in the hands of merchants rather than its single ruler. It was in a sense a civilization of engineers. And then, around 1900 BCE, that ordered world came undone. The cities shrank, the script and the standardized weights fell out of use, and the people drifted away. The cause is written in the climate. Liviu Gyosan and his colleagues reconstructed the region's ancient rivers and rainfall and found that the summer monsoon had weakened, drying the land year by year. As it faded, the Gagar-Hakra river system, which some link to the fabled Sarasvati of later texts, dwindled and died, taking with it the water that fed key cities. They moved east toward the more reliable rains of the Ganges plain, trading their great cities for smaller, scattered villages. Now here's where an old and dramatic story falls apart. For decades, people spoke of a massacre at Mohenjo-Daro, of invading Aryans cutting down the inhabitants based on scattered skeletons the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler read as a battle. That reading is now discredited. The bodies are not the remains of a single slaughter, and there is no evidence of a conquering army. Cameron Petry's research reframes the whole collapse not as a sudden death, but as a slow de-urbanization, a civilization adapting, city by city, to a drying and less predictable climate. The mainstream view is exactly that, a weakening monsoon and dying rivers driving people from their cities over centuries. Others emphasize shifting river courses and tectonics starving individual settlements. What is not in doubt is the scale of the warning. Monsoon-dependent South Asia is home today to well over 1 billion people, all relying on the same seasonal rains whose failure the Harappans could not survive. Number 10. Cahokia. On the flat Mississippi floodplain near what is now St. Louis, a mound of earth rises 30 meters into the sky, and 1,000 years ago a city spread around its base that was larger than London. Below it, a swollen brown river is drowning the fields. This was Cahokia, the greatest city in the Americas north of Mexico, and almost no one who lives beside its ruins today knows it was ever there. Cahokia peaked around 1050 to 1200 CE with a population of 10 to 20,000 people or more. Its centerpiece, Monk's Mound, is the largest earthwork in all of the Americas, about 30 meters high with a base covering some 14 hectares, built from an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, every basketful carried by hand. The city had a grand plaza, a timber circle of posts we call wood hinge that tracked the sun, and more than 100 mounds. In one of them, Mound 72, archaeologists found mass burials, including sacrificed young women laid in careful rows. This was a planned city that seems to have exploded into being around 1050, in what researchers call a big bang of rapid growth. It fed itself on maize grown across the fertile bottomlands, and those bottomlands were the weakness because the Mississippi is a river that floods. Samuel Munoz and his colleagues found sediment evidence of a major Mississippi flood around 1200 CE, arriving just as Cahokia began to decline, and tree rings record droughts through the same era that would have withered the maize. For a long time, the favored explanation was that Cahokia destroyed itself. The idea, argued by Neil Lopino and William Woods, was that the people cut down too many trees for fuel and defensive walls, causing erosion and worsening the very floods that ruined them. But here's the twist. In 2021, a geoarchaeologist named Caitlin Rankin tested that story in the ground and found no evidence of self-inflicted erosion at the site at all. The self-destruction narrative, so often repeated, simply did not hold up. What remains is a compound collapse, a great flood, recurring drought and mounting social strain, factional conflict and warfare that pushed the city to build a defensive palisade and a loss of the religious authority that had drawn people together in the first place. By around 1350 to 1400, Cahokia was largely abandoned, part of a wider emptying of the central Mississippi Valley that archaeologists call the Vacant Quarter. By the time Europeans arrived, the mounds stood silent, and the name we use, Cahokia, comes from a later people who had nothing to do with building it. The original city had been forgotten by the very land it once ruled, and the warning sits right where it always did. Cahokia rose on a floodplain of the Mississippi, the same restless river that still threatens St. Louis and the towns around it today. Number 11. The classic Maya. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, a limestone pyramid rises out of the trees. its stairways choked with vines, and at its foot lies a reservoir, cracked dry under a blazing sun. Carved stone monuments still stand in the empty plaza, covered in a written language, waiting for crowds that never came back. This is the world of the classic Maya, and its fall is the most misunderstood collapse on this entire list. The classic Maya of the southern lowlands across what is now Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico reached their height between about 250 and 900 CE. Their great cities, Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque, held tens of thousands of people amid the jungle. The Maya developed the most sophisticated writing system in the ancient Americas, a fully phonetic script. They grasped the concept of zero as a placeholder, kept a long count calendar that tracked millions of days, and charted the movements of Venus with astonishing accuracy in the pages of the Dresden Codex. Then, across the 9th century, the southern cities fell quiet. They stopped raising monuments, their royal dynasties failed, and their populations melted away into the forest. The reason is now written in stone and mud and rock. David Hodel and his colleagues drilled into the bed of Lake Chechankanab and found layers of gypsum that mark severe drought exactly at the collapse. Douglas Kennett read a stalagmite from the Yak Balum cave in Belize, whose growth bands recorded a long drying from around 820 to 870 CE. Other researchers estimated that rainfall may have fallen by 40 to 50% during the worst of it. Drought crippled the reservoirs and the rain-fed fields that the lowland cities depended on. As the water failed, warfare between rival city-states escalated, recorded on the last monuments before the writings stopped. Dynasty after dynasty collapsed, and the long count tradition ended city by city across the south. The mainstream view holds that these severe, repeated droughts undermined agriculture and shattered the political order. Others add that overpopulation, deforestation, and endless warfare had already made the society brittle, with drought as the final blow. But now for the misunderstanding, and it is a big one. People love to say the Maya vanished, as if a whole civilization simply evaporated into the jungle. That is flatly wrong. Millions of Maya people are alive today, across Mexico and Central America, speaking Mayan languages descended from their ancestors. What collapsed around 900 CE was not the people, but the classic political order, the great cities and their god-kings. The collapse was also uneven, sparing northern centers like Chichen Itza, which rose as the south fell. And that is precisely why it belongs here, as the most familiar name of all. The Yucatan still faces intense drought and the steady clearing of its forests, which makes the Maya not a vanished mystery, but a living study in what happens when a sophisticated society runs out of water. Line up all 11 of these collapses, and a single pattern rises out of them, and it is not a comfortable one. Advancement did not buy safety. In almost every case, the more sophisticated the civilization became, the more completely it depended on one fragile system, and that dependence was the thing that killed it. Look closely and water runs through nearly every story. An aquifer under the Sahara, canals in the Arizona desert, the berets of Angkor, the cisterns of Petra, the monsoon over the Indus, the reservoirs of the Maya. Strip the water away or send too much of it at once, and the whole structure falls. Some died slowly, starved over generations like the Garamantes and the Harappans. Others died in a single night like Helike, and, in its own way, Petra. And a striking number, the Hohokam, the Moche, the Khmer, were killed not by drought or by flood alone, but by the sky swinging violently between the two. There's another thread, just as important. When these societies fell, the final blow often came not from nature, but from within. Teotihuacan burned its own rulers. Cahokia fractured into conflict. Environmental stress was the pressure, but politics was frequently the fracture point. And through all of it runs one recurring illusion, the belief that clever engineering had finally conquered the environment, right up until the moment it hadn't. Sophistication buys power. It does not buy permanence. Which leaves an uncomfortable symmetry because every fragile system that erased these civilizations has a modern twin, only larger. Fossil aquifers are still being drained, from the Nubian sandstone beneath Libya to the Ogallala beneath the American plains. Hydraulic megacities still live and die by managed water. The monsoon still underwrites more than 1 billion lives. And El Niño still drowns the same coasts it drowned for the Moche. Our densest cities still crowd onto floodplains and seismic coastlines, exactly where Cahokia and Helike once stood. The difference is scale. Our systems are more optimized and more interconnected than theirs ever were, which, by the very pattern these collapses reveal, may make them more brittle, not less. But we hold one advantage that none of these lost peoples had. We can read their ice cores and their tree rings and their lake beds, and see the countdown they never knew was running. Collapse, in the record, is almost never truly sudden. It is visible in hindsight and sometimes in foresight too. The deep past is not a museum. It is a set of warnings, and the only real question is whether we choose to read them. If the deep past still has questions for you, there's another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.